A 17-year-old girl climbed out of a mangled car on a winding French cliffside road, badly injured but alive, having just watched her mother lose control of the wheel on a curve they had driven together countless times before. That girl would go on to marry a circus performer, run away with an elephant tamer, and raise 3 children by 3 different fathers, none of whom she ever married. Her brother would keep 2 secret children hidden from the public for years before finally acknowledging them as a reigning prince. And her older sister would bury a second husband within less than a decade of losing her mother. This is what actually happened to the 3 children Grace Kelly left behind. A princess born to a movie star. When Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier III of Monaco in April of 1956, the wedding was treated by much of the world as something close to a modern fairy tale, an American film star trading Hollywood sound stages for a genuine European throne. The ceremony itself unfolded across 2 days, beginning with a civil wedding inside the palace, followed by a grand religious ceremony at St. Nicholas Cathedral, drawing global press attention on a scale rarely seen before for a royal wedding anywhere in the world, with newspapers at the time frequently describing it as the wedding of the century. Grace's own transition from one of Hollywood's most sought-after leading ladies to a reigning European princess marked the effective end of her acting career, a decision she made deliberately in order to fully embrace her new role, even as filmmakers would continue trying to lure her back to the screen for years afterward. What followed over the next several years was the arrival of 3 children who would each, in strikingly different ways, come to define the House of Grimaldi for the rest of the 20th century and well into the 21st. Princess Caroline arrived first, born in Monaco on January 23, 1957, less than a year after her parents' wedding. Prince Albert followed roughly a year later, born on March 14, 1958, securing the family's line of succession as the future ruling prince. Then, in February of 1965, the family welcomed its third and final child, a daughter named Stephanie, born 8 years after her older sister, a considerable age gap that meant Stephanie would grow up somewhat separately from her 2 older siblings, who were much closer in age to one another throughout their own childhoods. Despite the extraordinary wealth and formality that surrounded the Grimaldi family's public image, both Rainier and Grace worked to keep their household feeling as ordinary as possible for their 3 children. Albert later reflected in interviews that his parents made a deliberate effort to ensure the household never felt overly formal or, in his words, palacey, describing a genuine effort on both his parents' part to create something resembling a normal home despite their unusual circumstances. Grace herself insisted on maintaining certain American traditions inside the palace as well, most notably Thanksgiving, a holiday virtually unknown in France at the time, which she made sure the family celebrated every single year, regardless of how unfamiliar the custom seemed to the rest of Monaco, even going so far as to insist on serving turkey, a dish that was reportedly difficult to source anywhere in the region during that era. All 3 children grew up with access to an extraordinary range of activities and education, taking lessons in ballet, piano, and flute, alongside more conventional schooling, and each of them displayed an early enthusiasm for athletics that would carry through much of their lives, trying their hand at gymnastics, swimming, and skiing throughout their childhood years. Caroline pursued her studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, following her secondary education, focusing on philosophy, psychology, and biology, an academic path that stood in contrast to the more public, ceremonial role she would eventually be called upon to fill. She had earned her French baccalaureate degree with honours in 1974, a notable academic achievement that received relatively little attention at the time compared to the constant coverage of her personal life that would follow in the years ahead. Albert, for his part, developed a genuine passion for athletics that extended well beyond the recreational activities typical of most royal children, eventually representing Monaco at 5 separate Winter Olympic Games as a member of the national bobsled team between 1988 and 2002, a level of serious athletic commitment that set him apart from many of his European royal counterparts. Stephanie, meanwhile, growing up nearly a decade behind her older siblings, developed her own passion for athletics and creative pursuits, trying her hand at classic dance, gymnastics, swimming, and skiing, according to her official palace biography, interests that would continue to shape her adult life well beyond her more publicized personal relationships. She graduated from Paris's Collège du Pont-Loup in 1982, just months before her mother's shocking death, a milestone that should have marked a hopeful beginning to her adult life, but instead arrived only weeks before the single most devastating event of her entire childhood. That comfortable, carefully constructed childhood was abruptly and permanently shattered in September of 1982, when a single car accident on a steep mountain road changed the trajectory of all three of their lives forever, and left the youngest of the three carrying a burden that would follow her for decades afterward. The crash that changed everything. On September 13th, 1982, Princess Grace was driving from the family's country home back toward the palace in Monaco, accompanied by her youngest daughter, 17-year-old Stephanie, who was seated in the passenger side of the car. As the vehicle wound along the steep cliffside roads of the Côte d'Azur region in southern France, Grace suffered what doctors would later determine was a small stroke behind the wheel. Losing control of the car, the vehicle veered off the narrow mountain road and tumbled down a steep 45-foot embankment before coming to rest. Stephanie, though badly shaken and injured, survived the crash. Grace suffered far more severe injuries, including significant trauma to her brain and chest, along with a broken leg. Both mother and daughter were rushed to a hospital, where Grace remained in a coma for approximately 24 hours before doctors determined that her injuries were unsurvivable and she was taken off life support. She died on September 14th, 1982, at the age of 52, having suffered what her death certificate ultimately listed as a brain hemorrhage. The news devastated not only the Grimaldi family, but sent shockwaves around the entire world, given Grace's enormous and enduring fame, both as a former Hollywood star and as a beloved figure within European royal circles. Her funeral, held just days later, drew an extraordinary gathering of dignitaries, entertainment figures, and ordinary admirers who had followed her remarkable journey from Philadelphia to Hollywood to the Mediterranean coast of Monaco, a journey that had captured public imagination for nearly 3 decades by that point. For Stephanie, the psychological aftermath of surviving that crash proved to be an extraordinarily heavy burden to carry, one that would take years, even decades, for her to begin processing. In a 1989 biography about her parents, she admitted that it had taken years before she could even begin to cope with what had happened, describing how she still could not bring herself to travel down the particular stretch of road where the accident occurred, even decades later, always asking whoever was driving to take an alternate route instead. Speaking again in 2015, she offered a more reflective take on having survived when her mother had not, describing a shift in her thinking that moved her past anger and toward the belief that she had somehow been spared for a reason, that she still had a place to occupy in the world despite everything that had happened that day. She has described the sense of injustice she felt in the years immediately following the crash, wondering why she had walked away with only minor injuries while her mother's had proven fatal, a question that by her own account took the better part of 2 decades to make any kind of peace with. While Stephanie carried the most direct physical and emotional weight of that tragedy, all 3 siblings now found themselves thrust into a completely different reality, one in which the eldest, 25-year-old Caroline, would be called upon almost immediately to step into a role of public responsibility that none of them had anticipated needing to fill so soon, setting the stage for a life that would itself be marked by its own devastating loss just 8 years later. Caroline steps into her mother's shoes and loses a second husband. In the immediate aftermath of her mother's death, Princess Caroline, only 25 years old at the time, found herself effectively serving as Monaco's surrogate First Lady, taking on diplomatic and philanthropic responsibilities that would normally have fallen to her mother. It was an enormous weight to place on someone so young, made even heavier by the fact that Caroline's own personal life had already been shaped by considerable turbulence in the years leading up to her mother's death. She had married a French businessman named Philippe Junot in 1978, a man 17 years her senior, a union that quickly proved troubled and ended in divorce by 1980. A very public disappointment that had already made Caroline a frequent subject of tabloid coverage throughout much of the late 1970s, appearing regularly in celebrity magazines during a period when her mother had largely managed to keep the family's private life out of the press. Following her mother's death, Caroline found renewed stability in a relationship with an Italian businessman named Stefano Casiraghi, whom she married in a civil ceremony in December of 1983, just 3 months pregnant at the time of the wedding. Because the Catholic Church had not yet formally annulled her first marriage to Junot, this second marriage was not initially recognized by the Church, a complication that would only be resolved years later when the annulment was finally granted in 1992, and the couple's 3 children were subsequently legitimized by Pope John Paul II the following year. Caroline and Stefano went on to have 3 children together in quick succession: a son named Andrea, born in June of 1984, a daughter named Charlotte, born in 1986, and a second son, Pierre, born in 1987. By most accounts, this second marriage brought Caroline a genuine sense of domestic happiness and relative privacy that had eluded her during the intense public scrutiny of her 20s, with Stefano running a successful real estate and export business in Milan that allowed the couple to maintain a comparatively low profile compared to the years immediately following her divorce from Junot. Then, in October of 1990, tragedy struck the Grimaldi family for the second time in less than a decade. Stefano, who had become a world champion offshore powerboat racer, competing in the sport since 1984 and winning the world title in 1989, was killed while defending his title during a trial run off the coast of Monaco. Eyewitnesses described his catamaran striking a large wave at nearly 100 miles per hour, flipping the 42-foot boat into the air. While his co-pilot was thrown clear and survived, Stefano remained strapped into his seat and was killed instantly when the vessel slammed back into the water. He was only 30 years old, and notably had reportedly helped rescue the crew of a competing boat that had caught fire just 1 day before his own fatal accident. Caroline, who had been in Paris at the time, rushed back to Monaco upon hearing the news, and thousands gathered for his funeral at Monaco's cathedral just days later, with Caroline's brother Albert seen comforting their younger sister Stephanie when she briefly became overwhelmed with grief and fled the ceremony in tears. The loss left Caroline a widow at just 33 years old, raising 3 young children entirely on her own, an eerie and painful echo of the sudden loss that had already defined so much of her family's recent history, coming just 8 years after her own mother's fatal accident had reshaped her life so dramatically. Caroline would eventually find lasting happiness in a third marriage several years later, to Prince Ernst August of Hanover, though that relationship would bring its own share of complications and public scrutiny over the following decades. But before her own story continued to unfold, It was her brother Albert who found himself navigating an entirely different and increasingly public set of complications, ones that would take years, and in some cases decades, to fully resolve in the eyes of the Monegasque public. Albert's secret children, revealed one at a time. As the only son among the three Grimaldi children, Albert carried the weight of Monaco's line of succession from a young age, eventually succeeding his father as reigning prince following Rainier's death in April of 2005, after Rainier had ruled the tiny Mediterranean principality for more than 55 years, one of the longest reigns of any monarch in modern European history. But long before he formally ascended the throne, Albert had already built a reputation as one of Europe's most eligible and most closely watched bachelors, a reputation that came with a considerable amount of tabloid attention throughout the 1980s and 1990s, including rumoured romances with a number of famous women, some reportedly including well-known models and actresses of the era, names that regularly circulated in European gossip columns for years without any of the relationships ever leading to marriage. What the public did not know for years, however, was that Albert had fathered two children outside of marriage during this same period. Children whose existence would only gradually come to light through a series of increasingly difficult revelations that would test both his own reputation and his relationship with his eventual wife. The first of these children, a daughter named Yasmin Grace Grimaldi, was born in March of 1992 in Palm Springs, California, the result of a brief relationship Albert had with an American woman named Tamara Rotolo during her vacation on the French Riviera in 1991. Yasmin's mother raised her daughter largely on her own back in the United States, and Yasmin did not have direct contact with her father until she was 11 years old. It would take until 2006, following DNA testing, before Albert publicly acknowledged that he was indeed her father, more than a decade after her birth, after Yasmin's mother had spent several years attempting to secure both recognition and child support from the prince. The second child, a son named Alexandre, was born in August of 2003, the result of a relationship between Albert and a French Togolese former flight attendant named Nicole Coste, whom Albert had met on a flight from Nice to Paris in 1997. Word of Alexandre's existence became public in 2005, when a French magazine published photographs of the boy in Albert's arms alongside an interview with his mother, who explained that she had decided to go public, in part because Albert had not yet followed through on earlier promises to formally acknowledge the boy following his own father's eventual death. Albert confirmed his paternity that same year, just before officially ascending to the Monegasque throne, following his father's death in April of 2005, meaning that Alexandra's existence became public knowledge at almost precisely the same moment his father was assuming the responsibilities of a reigning monarch. Because Monaco's constitution requires that only direct and legitimate descendants may inherit the throne, a provision amended in 2002 in part due to concerns over whether Albert would ever produce a legitimate heir, neither Yasmin nor Alexandre were ever in line to become ruling monarch, though both were granted inheritance rights to a share of Albert's considerable personal fortune. Both children have, over the years, spoken about their relationships with their father in relatively measured and even positive terms, with Alexandre in particular pushing back publicly against the term illegitimate being applied to him, insisting in a 2023 interview that his father had always been present in his life and that he carried the Grimaldi name with pride rather than shame, adding that he had never personally used any surname other than his father's own. Yasmin, for her part, went on to study theatre at Fordham University in New York City before pursuing acting and philanthropy, eventually building her own charitable foundation focused on supporting women in remote communities in Fiji, while maintaining what she has described as a close relationship with her younger half-siblings, having been photographed with them at various family gatherings over the years. Albert's path toward a more conventional family life finally arrived when he met South African Olympic swimmer Charlene Whitstock in 2000 at a swimming competition held in Monaco, though the two would not marry until 2011, in a lavish 3-day wedding ceremony reported to have cost close to $100 million, and that drew global attention. Their union was not without its own reported difficulties in the years that followed, including persistent rumors surrounding the circumstances of their wedding itself. But in December of 2014, the couple welcomed twins, Prince Jacques and Princess Gabriella, finally securing Monaco's line of succession with legitimate heirs and completing what had been, up to that point, one of the more complicated paths to fatherhood among any reigning European monarch. Yet even as Albert's own family life gradually stabilized, his younger sister Stephanie's personal journey was only beginning to reveal just how far she was willing to go in search of a life entirely on her own terms. One that would eventually lead her from Monaco's palace halls to the inside of a traveling circus tent. Stephanie's long search for a life of her own. Of the three Grimaldi children, Stephanie's adult life took by far the most unconventional and, at times, most publicly scrutinized path. One that seemed to reflect a deliberate and ongoing rejection of the formal, image-conscious world she had grown up in. In the years following her mother's death, she briefly pursued a career as a pop singer, releasing a record and even scoring some modest chart success in France. And it was during a related promotional tour in 1991 that her father assigned a bodyguard named Daniel Ducrouet to accompany and protect her. What began as a professional arrangement soon developed into a genuine romantic relationship, one that would generate years of tabloid headlines and considerable tension between Stephanie and her father, who was reportedly deeply unhappy about his daughter's involvement with a member of her own security detail. Stephanie gave birth to 2 children with Ducrouet before the couple ever formally married, a son named Louis, born in November of 1992, and a daughter named Pauline, born in May of 1994. Notably, Ducrouet already had another child from a separate relationship, born just months before Louis, a son named Michael, born to his girlfriend Martine Malbouvier, adding yet another layer of complication to an already unconventional situation, and meaning that Louis and Pauline would eventually grow up alongside at least one half-sibling from their father's earlier relationship. After campaigning hard for her father's approval, Stephanie finally married Ducrouet in July of 1995, largely in order to legitimize their 2 children under Monegasque law, a wedding that Rainier had reportedly resisted for years before finally relenting given his daughter's persistence and the fact that the couple already had 2 young children together by that point. The marriage, however, proved short-lived. In 1996, Italian tabloid magazines published photographs showing Ducrouet in a compromising situation with another woman, a former beauty pageant contestant, at a villa near Monte Carlo, a scandal that effectively ended the marriage within just 15 months, with the couple formally divorcing in October of that year. Reports at the time suggested Prince Rainier was furious over the public embarrassment the episode brought upon the family, and Ducrouet himself was subsequently banished from regular contact with Monaco's royal court. Rather than retreating from public attention following that painful and highly publicized divorce, Stephanie's personal life continued to generate headlines throughout the following years. She was briefly linked romantically to several public figures, including a well-known professional soccer goalkeeper and an action film star, before entering into a relationship with her own head of security, a former police officer named Jean-Raymond Gottlieb. In July of 1998, she gave birth to a 3rd child, a daughter she named Camille Marie Kelly, choosing not to formally name the child's father on the birth certificate at all, a decision that once again generated considerable public speculation and discussion throughout Monaco and beyond. Her father, reportedly displeased with the ongoing pattern of relationships with members of her own security staff, asked her to leave Monaco for a period, and Stephanie relocated to the French ski resort of Oran, where she was soon linked romantically to a bartender at a local restaurant before that relationship, too, came to an end after a relatively brief period of time. Perhaps the most unusual chapter in Stephanie's long search for stability came when she began a relationship with Franco Knie, a sixth-generation performer and co-owner of Switzerland's famed Circus Knie, a relationship that became public when Knie left his own wife of many years to be with her. For a period of roughly a year, Stephanie reportedly travelled across Europe with the circus, living out of Knie's caravan alongside her three young children, with her daughter Pauline even briefly appearing in one of the circus's own performances involving elephants, an experience Pauline reportedly enjoyed enough that Knie incorporated her into one of his regular acts for a time. It was an extraordinary image, a princess of Monaco living out of a circus trailer, one that captured just how far Stephanie seemed willing to travel, both literally and figuratively, in her search for a life that felt authentically her own, rather than one shaped entirely by her royal birth. Stephanie would go on to marry once more, to a Portuguese circus acrobat named Adans Lopes Perez, a fifth-generation performer 10 years her junior, in a secret ceremony held in Vendôme, Switzerland, on September 12, 2003. Reports at the time indicated the marriage lasted only about 10 months, with Stephanie briefly reconciling with her first husband Ducrouet before that reunion attempt also failed to last, and her marriage to Perez was formally dissolved in November of 2004 without producing any children. In the decades since, Stephanie has largely settled into a quieter public role, focusing much of her attention on charitable work connected to AIDS awareness and youth support programs within Monaco, serving as president of organizations including the Monaco Youth Centre and the Princess Stephanie Activity Centre, even as her earlier decades of romantic unpredictability remain some of the most widely discussed chapters in her family's modern history. Her long-running involvement in AIDS awareness campaigns in particular has been credited with helping to reduce stigma around the disease within Monaco and the surrounding region, work that she has continued for well over 2 decades with a level of consistency that stands in notable contrast to the more turbulent chapters of her personal romantic history during the 1990s and early 2000s, and one that she has described in interviews as among the most personally meaningful commitments of her adult life. But even as each of the three siblings settled, in their own ways, into more stable adult lives, all three remained bound together by a shared commitment to honoring the mother whose death had set each of their unconventional paths into motion in the first place. A shared legacy of honoring their mother. Despite the vastly different directions each of Grace Kelly's 3 children ultimately took in their personal lives, all three have remained consistently and genuinely devoted to preserving and honoring their mother's memory in the decades since her death. Shortly after Grace's passing in 1982, the family established the Princess Grace Foundation USA, an organization dedicated to supporting emerging talent in theater, dance, and film, a fitting tribute given Grace's own background as an accomplished actress before she ever became a princess, having won an Academy Award for Best Actress in 1955, and worked alongside some of the biggest leading men in Hollywood during her relatively brief but celebrated film career, including collaborations with Alfred Hitchcock that remain among the most studied works in the director's entire filmography. Prince Albert has taken on a leading role in overseeing the Foundation's work in the years since becoming Monaco's reigning monarch, ensuring that his mother's connection to the American arts world she once belonged to continues to be recognized and supported through scholarships and grants awarded to emerging performers and choreographers each year, a program that has helped launch the careers of numerous young artists across the decades since its founding. Albert has spoken publicly on numerous occasions about how frequently people continue to bring up his mother to him, even decades after her death, describing it as one of the most meaningful tributes to who she truly was as a person. Speaking on the 40th anniversary of her death in 2022, he reflected that what people most often remembered about her was not simply her beauty or her status as a fashion icon, but rather her warmth and the genuine humanity that others sensed in her during their encounters, whether brief or lasting, adding that he still finds himself thinking of her multiple times throughout an ordinary day, decades after her passing. Caroline, meanwhile, continued the diplomatic and philanthropic work she had first taken on in the immediate aftermath of her mother's death, remaining one of Monaco's most active public figures for decades, and earning praise from her own brother for her intelligence and sound judgment as she navigated decades of both personal loss and public responsibility. In 2002, Monaco's constitution was amended specifically to allow Caroline the right to succeed her brother Albert as ruling monarch should he fail to produce a legitimate heir of his own, a provision that ultimately became unnecessary once Albert and Charlene welcomed their twins in 2014, but one that nonetheless reflected just how central Caroline had become to the family's ongoing public role throughout the years following her mother's death. Stephanie, despite her more unconventional personal path, has likewise remained deeply involved in charitable causes throughout Monaco, serving as president of several organizations focused on youth development and public health, carrying forward, in her own distinct way, the same spirit of service that had defined so much of her mother's own public life following her transition from actress to princess. Colleagues who have worked alongside her on these various initiatives over the years have often remarked on just how hands-on her involvement tends to be, noting that she frequently visits the programs and facilities she supports in person, rather than simply lending her name and title to a cause from a distance. All three siblings have also participated together in various commemorative events honoring their mother over the years, including documentaries, retrospective exhibitions, and formal ceremonies marking significant anniversaries of her death, moments that have offered rare glimpses of the three adult children standing together publicly, despite the widely different paths their individual lives had taken since that devastating day in September of 1982. These joint appearances, though relatively infrequent, have consistently emphasized a shared sense of gratitude toward their mother and a mutual commitment to ensuring that her legacy, both as a beloved public figure and as their own personal source of guidance during childhood, would continue to be honored appropriately by the family she had left behind so suddenly and so young. Where the Grimaldi family stands today. More than 4 decades after Grace Kelly's death, the family she left behind has grown considerably, extending well beyond the 3 children who were left to navigate her sudden loss as young adults. Caroline's 3 children with Stefano Casiraghi have grown into adulthood themselves, with her eldest son, Andrea, largely maintaining a private, business-focused life away from official royal duties, while her son Pierre and daughter Charlotte have both remained connected to Monaco's public life in various capacities, attending official functions and, in Charlotte's case, building a notable career of her own within the equestrian and fashion worlds. Caroline herself went on to marry a third time, to Prince Ernst August of Hanover in 1999, a marriage that added the title of Princess of Hanover to her existing Monegasque titles, though that relationship, too, has faced its own share of public scrutiny and reported difficulties over the years since, including periods of prolonged separation and persistent tabloid speculation about the state of the marriage. Despite these reported challenges, Caroline has continued to serve as one of Monaco's most visible and respected public figures, regularly representing the principality at official functions both at home and abroad, a role she has now occupied in one form or another for well over 4 decades since first stepping into it as a grieving 25-year-old in the immediate aftermath of her mother's death. Albert's 4 children, 2 born outside of marriage and 2 born within his marriage to Charlene, represent one of the more complicated and closely followed succession stories among any of Europe's remaining royal families. Prince Jacques, as the elder of the twins by several minutes, holds the title of hereditary prince and stands as the direct heir to Monaco's throne, while his twin sister Gabriella holds the title Countess of Carlades. Both Yasmin and Alexandra, despite remaining outside the formal line of succession, have continued to build relationships with their younger half-siblings over the years, with family photographs occasionally surfacing showing all 4 of Albert's children together at various events, suggesting a level of family cohesion that might not have seemed likely given the complicated circumstances surrounding 2 of the children's births. Stephanie's own 3 children, Louis, Pauline, and Camille, have each carved out their own paths as adults, quite distinct from the more formal royal duties carried out by some of their cousins. Louis, who grew up largely in Monaco-Ville, attended Western Carolina University in the United States before eventually marrying Marie Roy Chevalier in 2019, going on to have 2 children of his own and occasionally making public appearances connected to the wider Grimaldi family. Pauline has pursued her own career in the fashion and wellness industries, building a public profile focused on health and lifestyle content that has attracted a considerable following in its own right, separate from any official royal responsibilities. Camille, whose father was never publicly named on her birth certificate, has maintained a comparatively lower public profile than either of her older half-siblings, though she has occasionally been photographed alongside her mother and siblings at family gatherings over the years. Taken together, the current generation of Grace Kelly's grandchildren and great-grandchildren now numbers well over a dozen individuals, spread across multiple countries and pursuing an enormously wide range of careers and lifestyles, from reigning monarchy to private business to fashion and wellness content creation. It is a level of growth and diversification that would have been difficult to predict standing at Grace Kelly's funeral in September of 1982, when her 3 children, ranging in age from just 17 to 25, were left to somehow carry forward both a grieving family and a small European principality's entire public image on their own, with no roadmap and very little time to grieve before the demands of public life came calling once again. Grace Kelly's death in 1982 remains, even now, one of the defining tragedies associated with modern European royalty, a loss that reshaped the lives of her 3 children in ways that continued to unfold across the following decades, through additional loss, through public scandal, through eventual stability, and through a shared, enduring commitment to preserving the memory of the woman who had once traded a celebrated Hollywood career for a very different kind of life entirely. The sheer range of experiences her 3 children went on to have, from Caroline's second devastating loss just 8 years after their mother's death, to Albert's complicated and gradually resolved path toward legitimate fatherhood and marriage, to Stephanie's remarkable, headline-generating search for a life built entirely on her own terms, together paint a picture of a family that, despite its enormous wealth and public prominence, proved just as vulnerable to grief, scandal, and the ordinary complications of family life as any other. What remains today is a family considerably larger and more complicated than the one captured in those early photographs of 3 young children growing up inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco, yet one that continues to carry forward, across multiple generations now, the legacy of the American film star who became their family's most enduring and most universally admired matriarch. From the Princess Grace Foundation's ongoing support of emerging artists to the way each of her 3 children ultimately found their own version of a meaningful, service-oriented adult life, Despite such vastly different personal journeys, Grace Kelly's influence has proven to be far more lasting than any single tragedy, however devastating, could ever have erased. More than 4 decades after that fatal drive along the cliffs of the Côte d'Azur, the woman who once captivated audiences on movie screens continues to shape the lives of a royal family that, in ways both public and deeply private, has never stopped finding new ways to remember her. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.